Hello, everyone, and welcome to day 6 of the BB27 Companion. Today, I'm going to talk about something that's been really bothering me, and I was hoping it wouldn't bother me as much this season, but lo and behold, that's just not how this is going to work out, which is the BB Blockbuster and its effect on live feeds. So, for those who don't know, one of the common discussions about the Blockbuster / last year was the AI Arena is its impact on the show and the pacing of strategy. One of the things that you would notice a lot is it's like traditionally how it would work is once the veto happens, everyone has a vote discussion, typically it's about a day at most long, and then most of the time is spent talking about next week. What's coming up, how can I prep for who will target who in the HOH, and sort of direct people's vision towards certain people I want. So that's kind of the vibe of where the season will go. It's saying, hey, I need you to be convinced that this person is a threat. I need you to be convinced that this is a problem. And that's normally how it goes. And then you go to live feed, and then it's sort of typically a unanimous vote, or the live episode, and then it's typically a unanimous vote. And then you have the HOH, and the cycle of the week starts and repeats, right? The difference is the AI Arena creates a really difficult complication, which is instead of having to have one vote discussion, you have to have three. What if this person wins? What if this person wins? What if this person wins? So in this case, for the BB27, you have Zay versus Amy. Zay versus Ashley. No, not Ashley. Zay versus Kelly. You have Ashley versus Kelly, or you have Amy versus Kelly. I don't know what's going on, but those are the three. Ignore any one time I said Ashley. And these three vote discussions all have very different needs or types of discussions, right? One of them is a guys versus girls in Zay versus Amy. One of them is a do we like Kelly versus, or guy versus do we like Kelly, which is a different kind of dynamic, and the other is between these two, like a girl who's like one of the girls is in the alliance versus do we like Kelly. Right, and so what you see is in these three different dynamics, you have very different questions that are being asked of each person, right? This, in theory, creates a really interesting outcome that exposes a lot of information. Because someone has to be able to say, within this kind of dynamic, what do I prefer? Within this separate kind of dynamic, what do I prefer? And in order to figure out the vote, you have to reveal a lot more cards about where you stand. You know, players like Adrian don't just have to pick between Zay and like someone like Amy, which is like, do I side with the guys or do I side with the girls? He has to also be able to say, okay, but do I piss off Vince with Kelly? Or do I piss off the bros? Do I piss off Vince or do I piss off the girls? And then one of the things that's wild here, right, that makes this interesting, at least in theory, and I do think it generally makes the game more interesting, we'll get to the problems in a second, right, is what this means is that for these players, you have to pick essentially a side between one of three options. And then you have to be public enough about which of the three options you're a fan of, that everyone else somewhat has to take notice. And at the end of the day, only one of these scenarios happens, but you have three separate questions you have to ask. And sometimes there'll just be two, and two different versions of that second question, right? Like it's a girl versus a guy, and another girl versus a guy, and then two girls. And theoretically, once the HOH is more settled, it'll really just be between like three guys. But especially in a moment like this, like there's really three different types of players. Amy, who's aligned with Rachel and Ashley really closely, sort of this Rachel who taking a shot at Rachel, Amy would be taking a shot at Rachel. You have Zay, who's in this like bro-y group, which now has an alliance called the Burger Boys, but it's not necessarily been like as strong strategically together. It's more just like a, hey, we want to protect Zay sort of connection. And then you have the Vince who stupidly put up his own ally in Kelly, who's like, please, please, please don't do this. And obviously the HOH doesn't have a lot of power, but Vince still has a lot of social connection because of that, right? So this creates an interesting dilemma. Which of these three options you do, and because Vince is partly such a wishy-washy HOH, it really ends week one, that really is a problem. Now, this in some ways is great, because there's a lot more information exposed. Players who are in the middle have to answer a lot of questions, but it also means there's a lot of, in the live feeds, there's really my problem, is there's a lot of very confusing vote talk. Because it's not like we're saying, oh, okay, let's have this discussion, what do we think? Now let's have this discussion, what do we think? Now let's have this discussion, what do we think? And so what happens, there's a lot of like a mix of telling the truth and lying that happen for all three vote scenarios. And as a live feeder, it can be very hard to track who's aligning where. Or someone who watches live feeds, right? Because there's three different scenarios, and with 14 people in the house, that means you need to be able to know how they're voting in how 42 different votes would align. And guess what? These house guests aren't exactly forthcoming with their answers. And as a house guest playing the game, it's a mess. Like, it's really hard to track. And so you watch over and over again, these house guests be like, okay, I think I have these votes. And they talk it through. And there's a lot of, like, question mark votes. And it's like they forget their votes. And then they get distracted because they're thinking about another one. Like, oh, I think I have Kelly in this case, but I don't have her in this case because she's on the block. I think I have Jimmy if it's against Kelly, but I don't know if I have Jimmy if it's against Amy. And, like, there's a lot of that kind of dynamic. It's really weird and scuffed. And it can be really hard to track as a feeder. And it's also really hard to track as a player. And so what this means, because this is also hard to track, because these players get stuck on this problem that is very, very hard to solve, they spend all their time talking about this vote. Because they can't get a clear answer for themselves. Like, they think they know, but they're often not exactly certain. And that creates a real problem in terms of the sort of next week of strategy. This sort of what I call the upper level of strategy. This, like, component that people have to be able to prove that they're really capable of, but often don't. That's really hard, which is showing that you can change people's minds about where to target in the future, guide people in certain directions. You're not doing that because you're spending all your time debating a vote with 42 different votes going on. And really it's 45 because Vince gets to break tiebreakers here, right? So Vince's vote matters. And so it creates a scenario where it's really hard to follow and track what's going on as a feeder in terms of the votes, but it's also preventing this level of strategy that I think is where Big Brother really showcases a player's talents. Like, for example, one of the most impressive things I've ever seen in my entire time playing was Tiffany's HOH, or Tiffany's before her HOH, her week 1. She, of course, is in with Frenchie. And there's a mess. Frenchie's slaughterhouse, whatever, is like a mess. And then week 2, she gets Kylan to put up to target Frenchie. And as soon as I think the veto is, like, done, Tiffany starts spending all her time focusing on, like, okay, everyone's voting on Frenchie. Let me focus on next week. And she's locking in Brent as the target. She talks to every person. She gets everyone on board. She makes people go, okay, I trust that this is the route. And then once she feels like everyone's on Brent, she says, okay, now I'm going to focus on 3 weeks from now in Whitney. And I'm going to prioritize talking to everybody there. And it's a lot of that kind of thing where everyone is listening and hearing, okay, this is why Whitney needs to go next. And then everyone's agreeing. And so she's like, great. Now let me start talking about 4 weeks from now after Whitney and who should go there. And of her eyes, I'm understanding her mostly sounds her Beth. But, like, she was now had set basically the entire pre-jury minus the last slot by just her, like, gameplay dynamic. Where before when we knew Frenchie was going out, we also already knew who the next 2 in a row would be because Tiffany was, like, using her incredible prowess to get targets established weeks from now. And that is really hard to do, to get people so on board with wasting power on someone who is not necessary, on someone who everyone just decided needs to go out, which is not necessarily good for people's games because, like, Whitney staying is inevitably going to be good for a lot of people's games, but Tiffany is able to get everyone so locked in and they keep that locked in pressure going when Brent goes and then Whitney goes, and that is a really high level of gameplay that I like to see in Big Brother. And then a week like this, you're just not seeing any of it because you're listening to over and over and over again these, like, vote discussions with these weird sort of, like, I have to think about these 3 scenarios that often blur together. Sometimes it's hard to track, okay, when you say you're protecting Amy, are you protecting Amy in all circumstances? You're protecting Amy in some circumstances. Some people are protecting Amy in one, some people aren't protecting Amy in another. And it's like there's a big sort of house alignment going on here, which is cool. But you're also seeing it occur in a very messy way, in a very hard to follow way, that's also preventing the next level strategy. Like, how many times do we, like, I have no sense of who's going home next week. I mean, the favorite would seem to be Keanu, but, like, there's really not a lot of discussion about next week. Like, there's no, like, hey, if you, like, we need to be looking at this person. Because, and there's occasionally some of it, but most of it's so wrapped around this vote in a way that can be kind of suffocating. You know, it also doesn't help that I think there's 3 nominees. Anytime a nominee is in a conversation during the eviction week, they're going to be talking about why they need to go home. And what's interesting, actually, and this is a good point to bring up, right? One of the problems that nominees, when you're on the block, has typically had is you were unable to think or plan about next week because you have to be focused on this week because you are on the block and you could be going home tomorrow, right? When you are in the game and there's 3 nominees, it means that and the vote is harder to establish. It actually reduces, I think, the disadvantage being a nominee is by a substantial amount because the other players aren't able to think about the next week. And what that also means is that one of the other things that happens, right, is when a nominee is in a conversation, it becomes solely focused on that thing. And when there's 3 nominees, that means there are 3 people running around the house who, if they're in a conversation, the game talk is fully going to be focused on this week. And so you really create a scenario where so much more of the conversation is around this week of gameplay, which I think is great, which I think is really rough for the live feeds. Because it also means if I need to check out for a bit, it's really hard to because so much is going on still. But it's also like a messy version of so much going on. On the other hand, and this is the real pro, this is why I think the AI twist is generally good, but I hate it personally, is the Thursday episodes are so much better. Because there are 3 scenarios and you don't know what's going on, it means that you can have a lot of really wild results as a result of 3 scenarios occurring. That someone can win and change the dynamic. That someone can stay and can make a speech and suddenly stay last minute. Because the players themselves aren't fully confident where the votes are going at any time. And so they think they have a couple of them figured out, but they don't always have all of them. And so it creates a more dynamic situation. It means that the question of who's going home is not a locked-in thing as we head into the live eviction, which is great television. The season is better from a television product because of it. But from a gameplay perspective, from an entertainment perspective of the live feeds, it is painful. It is a lot harder. It is confusing. I need to create a spreadsheet to follow what's going on, not because and I'm not a house guest. You know, I have more perfect information than they do, and I need a spreadsheet, which creates a lot of challenges. I want to see a player get better at figuring out how to get through this challenge of strategy and really figure out how to focus on next week. I think the next great all-time player is going to be the player who can do a good job of doing that, because that is where I think high-level Big Brother is really shown off. That is where high-level gameplay is really showcased, and it's really it's a subtle thing that doesn't have a massive impact in terms of what shows up on the episodes, but it has a massive effect on what happens in the game. And great players who can do that, and the great player who can do that while also getting through his vote conversation and figuring out how to navigate it, but also prioritize next week, I think will be the best player in the future. I remember I talked with Rubina, at the BB27 premiere party, and when she was like, you can't plan for next week, it's too hard. But I have a hard time thinking that's true. I think players just become so caught up in this week's vote because there's so much to think about that they're not prioritizing other things. And I want to see players who understand how valuable it is to prioritize thinking past the vote, even if the vote isn't currently fully established, which is hard to do, but I think it's a level of skill that will be very useful moving forward. On that note, that's all I have to talk about today. Thank you guys so much. I'm sorry this video is up again a little later. I am trying to recover with my life stuff. Now I'm back from vacation, and it's messy, and it doesn't help that feeds have been very confusing right now. Tomorrow you're going to see in the morning a review of week 1. My sort of final score, I'm going to score it from 1 to 10 on a scale kind of similar, I guess, to the IGN point scale. And I'll talk about sort of what I liked about this week, what I didn't like about this week, what I like about where the season's going, where you don't, and sort of do a week in review summary On that note, thank you guys so much. I am so excited to say that this is my 7th video. I'm really proud of myself for that. And I can't wait to continue throughout the season.